So my name is Matt Hofmann. I am one of the co-founders and the master distiller at Westland Distillery in Seattle. First, I would like to say how great this whole thing has been. I think this is really, really cool. We've all, I'm sure, been to a ton of conferences. And I think whoever, Dave and everybody from Box that helped to organize and put this thing on, you've done a bang-up job. So really, really well done. Just a round of applause. Okay, when I was asked to talk about something, I was asked to pick a topic, and establishing identity is actually one of my favorite things that I do as part of Westland. And I think it's increasingly important. There are 1,500, quote unquote, craft distilleries in the US. It's a lot. One of the interesting things, and I've been talking to several people about this over the past couple of days, is these craft distilleries are beginning to take market share from each other and not from the bigger players. There's a faster growth in craft distilleries than there is demand for craft spirits. And one of the reasons why we never use the word craft for us is because I think it's an imperfect way to describe things. Craft beer versus big beer, that's easy, because when craft beer started, it was just Budweiser at the bottom. Beer was really all the way down. Fact of the matter is, the big players, William Grant, everybody else, are producing good product right now. And so actually, personally, I don't like the term craft, and I think it's done people a disservice because they've latched onto this like it's the brewing world, but it's actually not. It's actually, in the U.S. anyway, it's more similar to the establishment of wine regions in Washington State or California or Oregon or something like that. So it is increasingly important, I think, for everybody, Westland included, to hone in on exactly what it is you are, understand what you are, and fully go after it and own it. So that's what I'm going to talk about today. So identity, many ways to define identity. I cheated. I used Wikipedia, and which is not cheating anymore, I guess. My teachers would just hate me for that. But a great definition is the condition of being oneself. And I think people just dive straight into this industry and don't really try to understand who they are and where they are, both physically, but also where they are in the grand scheme of this industry. So this is a really important thing. So this is kind of the way that I look at it. Figure out what your truth is, find your truth, and explore your truth, and embrace it. Embrace it with everything you've got, because that is what makes you unique. This is why I'm going to stand up here and tell you about all the cool innovations that we've got going on at Westland, because I know that nobody else in this room can do those as well as we can. Just in the same way that I know that I could not do Mizunara oak as well as they could do it in Japan. And there's all sorts of great stories like that. So first of all, where is Seattle? So what most people don't really understand is the US is a big place. You can see this overlay chart, US over Europe. The distance between Seattle and Kentucky, where bourbon is coming from, is the same distance as Ireland to Turkey. It's a big place. I've also been talking about, I've got a great slide that just sums up all of my struggles here over the past few years. Bourbon, I'm just gonna launch right into this now. So bourbon is only the US's national spirit. That's the way it's viewed. It's actually just a distinctive product of the US, basically because some guy made too much during the Korean War and petitioned his senator buddies. This is a real story. This is actually fact. He was gearing up. So in World War II, there was requisitioning of all the distilleries to make ethanol for the war effort. This guy in Illinois geared up when the Korean War started. He said, okay, they're going to do this again. There will be 4 years of no bourbon. So he started producing bourbon night and day. He ended up with like 9 years worth of supply, formed a lake, and then there was no requisitioning process. So what he did is he sent 2 cases to every US ambassador around the world and petitioned all of his legislative buddies to draft this bourbon as a distinctive product of the US. And that's how bourbon became the national spirit of the U.S. It's ridiculous. So there's a great book on this, by the way, Bourbon Empire by a guy named Reed Mittenbuehler. It's a fantastic book. Talks about the economics that go into the spirit world that we know and love today. So the point is, we're not in Kentucky. We're in Seattle, all the way up here. Here's Trump's lair here. So we're literally as far away in the continental U.S. as you can get from Kentucky. So we'll go to this next page here. So this is interesting right here. So this is what we would call the Pacific Northwest. So this, climate-wise, is kind of defined by some mountains that run right up the spine of Washington State, Oregon, and into California. West of that, you have a climate that is very similar to the UK. It's wet, it's rainy. You have this right here. This extends up into Canada. Here's Vancouver, BC, Canada, and Victoria, both fantastic cities. If you come visit us in Seattle and take a tour up there. So we have rainforests right here in Washington State, 150 inches of rain a year, which is some metric number that I'm not fluent in. Mountains, Seattle, which is rainy and gray, London-esque. Big mountains, and then desert. So lots of changes in and out. But the climate here in this belt in particular is very, very well suited to growing barley in the kind of traditional way. So now that we've got that established, everybody knows where Seattle is. So the big thing, first of all, is where are we? Well, we're in Seattle. There's no history of whiskey production in Seattle. And that's okay, and we should embrace that. It's the truth. And this is the thing that's going to come up over and over again, is this is the truth. So, but we also live in the best barley growing climate in the world. And people ask me all the time, what's our biggest challenge for Westland? And the biggest challenge, frankly, is bourbon in the States. Because I'm going to get to this slide here in a second that talks about the perils of bourbon. But when we explain to people why it is that we make single malt. We make nothing but single malt, and we do it because we're in a barley growing region. Seems to make sense. So that's the truth. And not only do we have a great barley growing region, we have peat bogs there. We have a local species of oak. That's fantastic. So we've got all the raw materials there. We've got great water, as every single distillery in the world says. They have perfect water. And then this is the other really important part that I think people don't think about as much, which is, who are we culturally? The Washington State, if I go back here, this is, from a Eurocentric point of view, this is the end of the world. I mean, when you had people who were coming over from Europe, coming this way, this is it. This is as far as you could get. The people who ended up out there, our ancestors, they're explorers. They are restless people. You can see it in the products that we make in the tech industry, which thrived, growing up here on the West Coast. This is the origin of craft beer. It's in our DNA as people. And I think that is an incredibly, incredibly important thing for us to recognize. And I think that's why I asked this question to Yasmin about this yesterday, because this to us is a big part of who we are. And we're all the way on this end of the spectrum. And then you have kind of the more traditional here, and then everybody else can kind of fall in between. But this is something that we embrace the fact that we are an innovative, creative people. We're restless people, and that's a really good thing, especially in this business. So, bring it all together. We live in one of the best barley producing climates in the world, best possible climates for single malt whiskey, and we are an innovative people. So this, again, something that Yasmin was saying yesterday as well. We do not seek to replicate Scottish whiskey in the United States. We seek to create Westland American single malt whiskey. And this is crucially, crucially important, because a copy is only ever going to be as good as the original. But if you are authentic and you embrace what you have there, it may be different, but it will be your own, and it will be unassailable. And this is part of identity. This is part of, in my opinion, creating the most compelling products, but it's also a marketing position as well. So exploring our culture, innovation, freedom of thought, mindfulness, creativity, craftsmanship, these are things that kind of define the Pacific Northwest, especially in Seattle. So how can we take these ideas, and I'm calling them cultural raw ingredients for lack of a better term, how can we allow that to come into our whiskey? And we should highlight that. We should not be afraid of letting those things come in, but of course we're not afraid of doing that because that's the whole culture to begin with. So starting with what's available. So many people tried this whiskey last night, our American Oak. We call this our flagship whiskey. For those of you who didn't get a chance to try this, the reason why we call this our flagship whiskey is because it represents this philosophy. Most of the grain, 80-ish% of the grain, and this actually 85% in this, is coming from Washington State. Again, good barley growing climate, but it's the way that we approached the raw ingredients that was indicative of the philosophy, indicative of the culture of where we're from. So roasted malts, with the exception of the Glenmorangie Signet, in 600 years in Scotland, nobody's bothered to try to use roasted malts in whiskey. It's done in beer all the time. Why not? Great flavor, lower yield, of course. Brewer's yeast, same thing. We use a Belgian Saison brewer's yeast. This is as far away as you can get from a distiller's yeast. It's a slow fermenting. We cap it at 27 C maximum fermentation temperature. Tons of great esters. It's beautiful, but this is part of the kind of craft brewing influence that we have. Air-dried virgin oak. We have a lot of access to American oak, being in the US. But we also approach this differently. We don't cheap out on our oak. We use nothing but air-dried oak. That is critically important. So the end result, who was able to taste this yesterday? Many people, great. So you know that it tasted different from Scottish whiskey, and that's exactly the point. It's the same raw ingredients, but because we're allowing this philosophy and culture and who we are to be in our whiskey, our identity to be in our whiskey, it makes a different product. But ultimately, we feel like this is the most authentic product we can make, if that makes sense. So that's why it's our flagship whiskey. So this is my favorite slide. This is difficult. How old is it? Is it 12 years old? Is this bourbon? Why isn't it bourbon? Aren't all American whiskeys bourbons? Americans make lousy whiskey. This doesn't taste like Scotch. Are you sure this isn't bourbon? And then my favorite, and I'm going to say this with the proper awful accent. I only drink whiskey that's old enough to buy a whiskey. Which means buying a 21-year-old whiskey and up. Ugh. You know, this is the world that whiskey. This is where you start getting depressed, right? This is the tough part, and this for us is our big challenge. A lot of people think that we were insane for diving into and helping to create a brand new category. There was no such thing as American single malt whiskey when we got started. There was a couple of producers who had laid down some casks here and there, but the idea of American single malt did not exist. So we could have just went and bought bourbon from MGP and called it a day, but it's not authentic. It's not true. It's boring. You know, it's just, I don't want to be in that business at all. And neither should you, for that matter. Now I'm preaching a little bit. So I will couch this in things. One of the important things that comes with this kind of innovation, and you can tell we're going really hard straight at innovation, is you have to have context. History and tradition are important, especially in the world of single malt whiskey. And there's nothing wrong with history and tradition. I think finding the right balance is the important thing. It depends on where you are. For us, we're a little bit heavier on innovation, but I respect the hell out of the Scottish whiskey industry. They make great product. I mean, there's nothing, as many of the other speakers have said, there's nothing inherently wrong with Scottish whiskey as it is now. We just think that there's more potential for single malt whiskey in the future. So this is, when we dove straight into the American oak, as you guys would tell, this is a different flavor profile of the whiskey. And sometimes people can't understand it because it is so different. So we kind of dive into these two whiskeys. So we have what we call the core range. We've got the American oak, the peated, and the sherrywood. These allow us to give people context. We're not abandoning tradition entirely. There's great things, sherry cask stuff. This is kind of, I guess these days, the most popular style of whiskey coming out of Scotland. But then peat, it's too important to give all of that stuff up. And this has helped us tell our story to everybody else. So this is the whole idea, and this is where we're able to set up from the beginning, because a lot of what I'm about to describe, we had to do all of this stuff ourselves. None of what is coming up existed before. So this is our launch pad, so to speak. American oak, peated, sherrywood gives people, you guys make single malt. I understand sherry casks. I understand peated. You can tell it's very blunt naming conventions. Westland peated, Westland sherrywood. It's a communication tool, and it helps people understand that, hey, you can make single malt whiskey in the U.S. So now we're going to get into exploring our terroir. We talked about the culture thing. But let's embrace this, what comes with the Pacific Northwest. So we've got all of the raw ingredients in place to make single malt whiskey. This is one of my favorite points here. We recognize that the formula for single malt whiskey today is based primarily on economics. And everybody, who was I just talking to about this, like literally 5 minutes ago, was everybody, there's a lot of people out there, less now these days, who think that Scottish whiskey has been matured for 12 years, for 300, for all time. But the only reason why age statements became popular is because they didn't know how to sell whiskey in the 70s. And so they had a bunch of it. It's the thing is with tradition is there are parts of tradition that are good and worth saving. There are some things that are just based on the business of whiskey, and you need to know that it's okay to throw those out. So again, but this is also part of the culture of the Pacific Northwest. This is who we are. We're not afraid to just kind of take the leap there on it. We also don't have the SWA breathing down our back. So this is a really cool picture coming up. So this is a local variety of barley. Now this is called purple obsidian. This is the natural color of it. It is not roasted. So we're going to use what we have locally. So there's a few things, Copeland and Metcalfe. These are some of the bigger varietals of barley that are available in the Pacific Northwest. Purple obsidian, great story. It's approximately 2,000 years old, Egyptian in origin. It found its way into Washington State as part of a failed camel trading route 120 years ago, which is incredible. What a ridiculous story that is. Full pint. So we have these things that are available. But the important thing here, these are not malting varietals. Copeland and Metcalfe are. But when you think about single malt whiskey, a lot of people think of is your barley malting barley. And that's fundamentally looking at it wrong. You can malt anything. You just need to approach it differently. I'm going to talk about what that means here in a second. This tastes incredible. We're going to make our first mash out of this next month. The malting company that we work with, called Skagit Valley Malting Company, they make what are called smash beers, single malt and single hop, so you only change the varietal of barley. So you can taste the difference in beer. And if all of the other pale malts, Pilsner malts, tasted like a Pilsner, this tasted like fresh plum juice. It was glorious. So the point of this is to think about flavor first. These are the things that grow here. Just because it doesn't malt in 7 days or doesn't yield, 400 LPA per ton, who cares? You want it to yield something, but you got to think about flavor first. It seems very obvious to us. This is the big point. We adapt, with the help of Skagit Valley Malting Company, we adapt the malting conditions to suit the grain, not the grain to suit the malting conditions. We are in a place in our kind of global economy, in a lot of places in the developed world, where we're getting beyond commodities. We're getting beyond commoditization, especially for food. The commodities market has done a lot to help these kind of first world countries grow and have a lot of access to food over the past 150 years. But now what's done, so malting grade barleys, especially the ones that are approved, the AMBA list, American Malted Barley Association, but also the Scottish equivalent, I don't remember what the name is, but they develop types of barley in the lab to meet the malting conditions set out by these groups. And it needs to yield X amount per ton, it needs to yield this amount per acre. It needs to malt in 7 days. If it malts in 5, it's rejected because the system runs on 7 days. Flavor is never considered. And that's, it's absurd. And I'll talk more about that in a second too. So these guys at Skagit Valley Malting, it's totally worth a visit. If you come to Seattle, I'll show you these, it's just like mind-blowing. They design malting equipment that is flexible and can work around the parameters. This malts in 9 days. It's going to yield very little. It will be probably at 200 LPA per ton on this, but it tastes incredible. These are the things that we need to start thinking about as an industry. So that's where we are today. Now here is where we're kind of pushing things going forward. So this is this kind of self-reinforcing cycle of the local barley and terroir, and then our cultural raw ingredients. So now we've got the local raw ingredients here, but then us as an innovative people, we're taking these and we're reapproaching them and pushing these things forward. So it keeps spiraling forward. One of the big things that we have here is, I was mentioning this book, The Third Plate, yesterday. So farmers in this region, so this is called the Skagit Valley. It's about an hour north of Seattle. They're mostly Dutch immigrants to the US, and so they make a ton of money growing tulips every year. Tulips are very, very lucrative, but they are devastating to the soil, so they can't grow them year in and year out. So what they've been doing, because they practice traditional agricultural methods, is they've been, for 100 years, ever since they've been here, they planted barley right after their tulips. That helped to put carbon back into the soil, break disease cycles. Then they'll plant beans to get your nitrogen back in, and then you can plant tulips again. Nothing else goes into the system. For the most part, it's entirely organic. This is a system of agriculture that is practiced. You Europeans will note this, but when you think about the US, it is monoculture, corn, dumping all sorts of bullshit in there. This is a return to the agricultural methods that have worked for everybody for hundreds of years around the world. So that's a big part of what we're trying to talk about with this, is it's not just, this is why I was saying yesterday, it's not local for the sake of being local. It's local because it's good for the soil here. It's good for these farmers. We can now take this barley. They were growing it just to help their soil out. They would not make money on this. They would either throw it away or sell it as feed. But now we can pay them good money for malting grade barley. So this helps the farmers stay in business, which is a difficult thing right now in the States. I don't know if it's like that in Europe. Helps the farmers stay in business, and it's good for the environment, and ultimately it's going to make better whiskey. It's triple bottom line type stuff. But this is the things we need to be thinking and moving forward, and this is such a Seattle thing. This is how Seattle thinks about everything. So this is the sustainable agricultural movement thing here. The bread lab. So this is really cool. There's a guy who was breeding grains at Washington State University. Its primary lab is 5 hours east of Seattle. Monsanto, anybody are you loosely connected to Monsanto in here? Don't raise your hand. So Monsanto approached him and said, hey, we need you to breed a variety of wheat, actually, for us. And he said, no, I'm not going to do that. I'm a public university professor. I breed for the public good, so everybody can use these varietals, not have a Monsanto trademark on it. Well, that got him in trouble. That got him in a lot of trouble. Big Ag stepped in, threatened to pull funding from Washington State University. And if you think this is a political issue, this is not Republican or Democrat. In fact, the Democratic governor at the time was one of the chief proponents of kicking this guy out. So he kind of rattled the cage a little bit. And so they banished him to this place in the Skagit Valley, an hour north of Seattle, where he established this thing called the Bread Lab. It's the first grain breeding lab in North America that also has a bakery on site, to see how it tastes. Like nobody's ever thought of that. It's ludicrous. And now they've added on to that. They have a brewery on site. They're going to start production of the distillery this year, I believe. So they can take these grains and figure out how they're going to be applied to the brewing and distilling business. It's incredibly exciting. These guys are James Beard award-winning folks, and they're featured in documentaries and stuff. They're famous all around the world. That's what we got right in our backyard. So I think this picture is really pretty. Took it myself. So this is a different variety of barley called Black Butte. So it's a 6-row. It's kind of black bluish in color. There are 15,000 varietals of barley that are being grown at this extension center, this agricultural center north of Seattle. So the ultimate idea is you have this kind of self-reinforcing system. I was kind of mentioning that before. But if you really think about it, the fact that if we were to just take Copeland or even Concerto, right? Everybody knows Concerto, and plant that in the ground in Washington State, we could go, great, this is local. but that kind of misses the point. Ultimately, we want to make the most compelling whiskey possible, the most authentic whiskey possible. So we're embracing this kind of this culture of trying to push things forward and make things better. It's who we are, and I think that's something that can be applied to basically everybody else as well. We've got, I know we don't quite have the time to get so much into this, but we've got examples of this with peat. This is not a great picture. This is local peat. Yes, it looks different than Scottish peat. That's okay. We'll be fine. We'll be all right. It's delicious. There's this plant called Labrador tea. Rosemary, lavender, and orange peel notes. It's hyper aromatic. It's oily. Most of the peat is composed of these leaves. You come off this so that you can see the plant back here. This is going to taste different, and that's okay, and we can explore these different elements in the whiskey. Same thing with oak. This is a Gary oak, only grows in the Pacific Northwest region. Yes, it's different than Quercus alba. Who cares? It's delicious. Actually, in my opinion, better than Quercus alba. It's fantastic, fantastic for making whiskey. So the point is, we're doing this, and I don't have time to get into the full stories, but we're doing things like this with the Bread Lab and Skagit Valley Malting with partners in those fields as well. So that, to kind of quickly sum up, is how we've kind of embraced our identity as Westland. And we've spent a lot of time figuring out who we are as people, doing a lot of self-study and self-reflection, and looking at our agriculture, and also looking at the history and balancing all of those things out. And we think that by fully embracing that, again, you can go and you can take that Black Butte varietal that you just saw there on the page, and you can plant it in Japan or in Sweden, but it might not work. These are varietals that are going to work great for us, and we embrace this wholeheartedly. And this is what's great about this. Ultimately, at the end of the day, we can talk about all this together. There's not going to be competition. I'm not trying to out Sweden, or out Japan, or even trying to out Scotland. We can all exist and all be unique and authentic in these different ways, as long as we kind of embrace our identity. So that's what I got. Thank you.
Right. That was absolutely fantastic stuff, actually, Matt. That was great. It was wonderful to hear deep thinking. People actually just going deep into the soil, but also deep into the cultural aspects of whiskey. It's something I know I'm getting increasingly obsessed about, that this idea that there is a cultural terroir as well as a physical terroir.
Yeah.
It is made by people in a specific place. And the more people talk about that, the better, as far as I'm concerned. We are slightly tight on time, but we are all coming back up on stage. But I will take a couple of questions, because I'm sure somebody will want to ask Matt something about that. Really? Nobody? That's a shame. Because what do you think that in general, we'll just kind of talk about that cultural thing. So do you think that is one aspect of whiskey that's not really been recognized? People are interested in process, yes, and they're interested in packaging or whatever, but not actually that deep.
One of the things that I love about American single malt as a category is we have the ability to showcase the different climate variations that you get. So, for example, in Arizona and New Mexico, they're using mesquite to smoke their barley instead of peat. That is more authentic there than it would be for peat. But then you look the cultural thing. People in the U.S. are very different from each other, in case you haven't noticed recently. And that's the beauty. I mean, multiculturalism is the beauty of America. That's kind of the point. But when that's expressed in whiskey, like the East Coast single malts that you see out there, East Coast American single malts, generally tend to be more conservative, tend to be more aligned with the old world. The West Coast single malts tend to have more of this kind of craft brewing influence, tend to be a little bit more innovative. The single malts in Texas are big and brash and very Texan, and I think that's amazing. I think to embrace that and just let that be a part of your whiskey, that's something. I mean, Scotland is relative to the U.S. much more homogenous as people, and that's something that we can do. Yes, yeah, slightly smaller, yes. Yeah. So, yeah, I mean, it's not been expressed as much, I think, the way that you can look at it is the Japanese. That's one of the easy things you can kind of point to with Japanese culture versus Scottish culture, and the way that, making whiskey that's light and delicate and elegant and that sort of thing. But no, it's never talked about at all. Yeah. It's too bad.
Yeah, I think one of the other things is coming out of that talk is to reinforcing that very important fact that Scotland makes the best Scotch, and Japan makes the best Japanese whiskey, and you're making the best American single malt or Pacific Northwest single malt. And that's a message I think for all distillers, and no matter where they are in the world. You make the best Austrian if you're in Austria, you make the best Netherlands if you're from the Netherlands, etc., etc. Martin, and this has to be the last question for the session. Sorry.
Very interesting to hear you speak about barley varieties and flavor. Have you tried matching different barley varieties with different yeast strains?
No, yeast is one of the things that. One of the other things, actually, I'm glad that you brought this up. One of the great things about identity is focus. We have just gone straight ahead into American single malt, and specifically in our production process, we use that Belgian Saison brewer's yeast. I love the idea of using different yeasts and mixing and matching, but our focus is on barley and it's on malt. So that's the one place where we have not deviated from the standard. We've kept that the same the whole way through and will forever.
Ladies and gentlemen, please put your hands together for Matt.